The night of February 18th, 1945, Northern Apennine Mountains, Italy. Private First Class Dan Kennelly crouched at the base of a 2,000-foot vertical rock face, his fingers numb inside wool gloves as he tested the manila rope one final time. Above him, lost in, "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Darkness and fog. Riva Ridge rose like a fortress wall, sheer cliffs of wet shale and ice that German commanders had declared unclimbable. Behind Kennelly, 700 men from the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment waited in the freezing mud, each carrying 55 pounds of combat equipment, ammunition, climbing gear, and weapons. They had 4 hours to reach the summit without making a sound. If German sentries heard even a single dislodged rock clattering down the cliff face, machine guns would shred the entire column before they climbed 200 feet. What these soldiers were about to attempt had no precedent in American military history. Every conventional military assault doctrine said it was impossible. Every general who'd tried to take this ridge through traditional means had failed with catastrophic casualties. But Private Kennelly wasn't thinking about doctrine or history. He was thinking about the rope in his hands, the pitons hammered into rock by scout teams over the previous 2 weeks, and the simple physics he'd learned as a teenager climbing mountains in Montana. Sometimes the impossible just means nobody's been stubborn enough to try. The story of how a division of ski instructors, college dropouts, and farm boys revolutionized mountain warfare begins not in Italy, but in the mountains of Colorado, where the United States Army was building something it had never attempted before, an entire division trained to fight where armies weren't supposed to go. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By January 1945, the Allied advance in Italy had ground to a frozen, bloody stalemate. General Lucien Truscott's Fifth Army faced a German defensive line that had held firm for months, anchored on a series of mountain ridges in the northern Apennines. The objective was clear: push north through the Reno River Valley along Highway 64, break into the Po Valley, and cut off German forces before they could retreat into the Alps. But between Truscott's divisions and that objective stood Mount Belvedere, a 3,800-foot peak that dominated the valley like a medieval fortress. German artillery observers on Belvedere could call accurate fire on anything that moved in the approaches below. Every American and Brazilian unit that attempted to assault the mountain had been driven back with devastating losses. The Brazilian 1st Infantry Division had been trying to take neighboring peaks for weeks, suffering heavy casualties without gaining decisive ground. The 92nd Infantry Division had made multiple attempts. All had failed. The problem wasn't courage or firepower. American forces had both in abundance. The problem was terrain and observation. The Germans held the high ground, could see everything coming, and had turned the mountains into a killing zone that conventional infantry tactics couldn't penetrate. But there was a detail that every previous commander had either missed or dismissed as irrelevant. 3.5 miles west of Mount Belvedere, across a narrow valley, rose another ridgeline. It was higher than Belvedere, steeper, and far more imposing. From the Dardania River at its base, the eastern face of this ridge climbed nearly 2,000 vertical feet in less than half a mile. The slopes varied between 60 and 80 degrees of steepness, loose shale, ice in the shadows. Small waterfalls freezing into the rock. German commanders had looked at this terrain and made a calculation that seemed entirely reasonable. The ridge was unassailable. No army could climb that face, especially not while carrying weapons and equipment. They named it Riva Ridge and placed minimal defences on the eastern approaches, perhaps 40 to 50 soldiers manning dug-in positions with machine guns at the top. The Germans weren't worried about the cliff itself. They were watching Mount Belvedere, where they expected the Americans to keep trying the same failed assaults. When Major General George Price Hayes took command of the 10th Mountain Division in November 1944, he was 52 years old, a Medal of Honor recipient from the First World War, and known for 2 qualities: blunt assessment of tactical problems and absolute confidence in his soldiers' capabilities. Hayes studied the terrain around Mount Belvedere for 3 days after arriving in Italy. On the 3rd day, he called his regimental commanders together and pointed to Riva Ridge on the map. "That's the key," he told them. "We don't take Belvedere until we take that ridge. German artillery observers on Riva can see every approach to Belvedere. They'll massacre anyone who tries a conventional assault. We go up Riva first, at night, and we go up where they're not watching." His staff officers looked at the topographical maps showing the eastern face of Riva Ridge. "Sir, previous units have assessed that cliff as unclimbable for any military force." Hayes looked at his officers. He'd spent the previous year watching this division train in the Rocky Mountains. He'd seen them climb peaks above 14,000 feet in blizzard conditions. He'd watched them navigate terrain that regular infantry wouldn't attempt. "Then previous units didn't have mountain infantry," he said. "We're going to climb it." The 10th Mountain Division existed because of a civilian ski instructor's stubborn belief that America needed soldiers who could fight in mountains. Charles Minot Dole, founder of the National Ski Patrol, had watched the Soviet Union's disastrous winter war against Finland in 1939 and 1940. Finnish ski troops, vastly outnumbered, had decimated Soviet formations by using terrain and winter conditions as weapons. Dole became convinced that if Nazi Germany ever won in Europe, an invasion of North America would come through the St. Lawrence River Valley, mountainous, heavily forested, brutal in winter. The United States Army had no units trained for that kind of warfare. Dole pestered every military and political contact he had. He wrote letters. He lobbied Congress. He compiled reports on every foreign mountain unit he could find. In September 1940, he finally got a meeting with General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. Marshall listened to Dole's pitch and made a decision that broke with every military tradition. He authorized the creation of a mountain warfare unit and told Dole that the National Ski Patrol would recruit the soldiers. It was the first and only time a civilian organization would directly recruit for the United States military. The requirements were specific. Applicants needed a letter of recommendation from the National Ski Patrol, certifying their skiing ability, mountaineering experience, or outdoor expertise. The standards were high enough that many applicants were rejected. Those who made it through came from backgrounds the Army had never assembled in a single unit. World champion skiers from Europe who'd fled the Nazis, Ivy League students who'd spent their summers climbing in the Rockies, ski instructors from Vermont and Colorado, trappers from Alaska, farm boys from rural Georgia who'd never seen a mountain before arriving at Camp Hale. By July 1943, the 10th Light Division Alpine was activated at Camp Hale, Colorado, situated at 9,500 feet, elevation between Red Cliff and Leadville. The training that followed would become legendary, though not always for reasons the soldiers appreciated at the time. The Army had decided that if it was going to build a mountain division, it would build the best. Training took place between 9,000 and 14,000 feet in deep snow, often in blizzard conditions. Soldiers learned to ski while carrying full combat loads. They learned to survive for weeks in sub-zero temperatures without returning to barracks. They learned rock climbing, ice climbing, avalanche assessment, winter navigation, and mountain rescue. The specialized training came at a cost. During one 3-week exercise in the mountains, official statistics recorded 195 cases of frostbite and 340 other incapacitating injuries. The temperature remained below freezing for 4 months of each year at Camp Hale. Soldiers slept in shallow holes dug into frozen ground, often with just one blanket or half a sleeping bag. But the training created something unprecedented. By the time the division shipped to Italy in December 1944 and January 1945, the men of the 10th Mountain Division were comfortable in terrain that would paralyze regular infantry. They were fit, proud, and unconventional. More importantly, they believed they could climb anything. That belief was about to be tested against German defenders who thought the cliff face of Riva Ridge made conventional military assault impossible. In mid-January 1945, the 1st Battalion of the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment quietly moved into small villages along the Dardania River Valley, directly below Riva Ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hampton commanded the battalion. His orders from General Hayes were direct: scout routes to the summit, prepare for a night assault, and maintain absolute secrecy. German observers on the ridge couldn't know anything unusual was happening. For 3 weeks, small reconnaissance patrols slipped out after dark. They were looking for something that military doctrine said didn't exist: routes up a near-vertical cliff face that could be climbed by combat-loaded infantry in darkness without specialized equipment beyond rope, pitons. The patrols worked with methodical care. They studied the cliff through binoculars during daylight, noting every crevasse, rock, outcrop, and potential handheld. After darkness fell, they moved to the base of the ridge and began climbing. Each patrol tested different approaches, looking for lines that avoided the steepest sections while still reaching the summit. The Germans above them never noticed. Why would they? The cliff wasn't guarded because the Germans believed it didn't need to be. Eventually, the scouts identified 5 potential routes to the top. 2 would require fixed ropes at the steepest sections. The others could be climbed without assistance, though barely. Each route had been mapped in detail. The scouts noted every dangerous section, every place where loose rock might betray the climbers, every spot where water seepage had created ice on the rock face. Then they did something that would prove decisive. Under cover of darkness, lead climbers went back up those routes and began installing the infrastructure for the assault. They hammered pitons into the rock at key points. They attached snap-links carabiners to those anchor points. They laid in fixed rope sections at the most difficult passages, securing them to the pitons so that following troops could clip onto the rope for stability. The work was done in complete silence. Piton hammers were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Every piece of equipment was tested multiple times. The Germans heard nothing. By early February, the 5 routes were prepared. General Hayes reviewed the reconnaissance reports and made his final decision. The assault would proceed on the night of February 18th. 4 of the 5 routes would be used. 700 men from the 1st Battalion, 86th Regiment, augmented by Company F from the 2nd Battalion. They would climb in darkness, achieve surprise, and hold the ridge through whatever German counterattacks followed. The main assault on Mount Belvedere would commence the following night, February 19th, with the rest of the division, some 12,000 men from the 85th and 87th Regiments. But none of that would matter if Riva Ridge couldn't be taken first. Hampton gathered his battalion and explained the plan. Every man would know not just his own role, but the entire operation. He refused to handpick elite soldiers for the assault, despite the fact that 30% of his force hadn't trained at Camp Hale. Instead, he trained platoons as complete units. This increased morale and spirit, he later wrote. They all knew they were going up together. The tactical plan was precise. Each of the 4 assault columns would be led by an advance platoon, moving 30 minutes ahead of the main force, and each advance platoon would be led by 3 expert climbers whose job was to pick the trail and ensure the fixed ropes were secure. The climb would be conducted at night without noise. Even the final equipment checks had to be silent. Each soldier carried a 55-pound pack, Mohn rifles or carbines, ammunition, grenades, climbing gear for those in the lead elements. 4 blankets per man. Sleeping bags weren't available, rations, though frozen, water, when they could find it. The men assembled in the mud at the base of Riva Ridge as darkness fell on February 18th. Above them, the cliff disappeared into fog and black sky. German positions at the summit were invisible, but everyone knew they were there. Machine guns, mortars, veteran troops from the German 1044th Infantry Regiment who'd been holding these mountains for months. If the Germans discovered the assault before the Americans reached the top, the entire column would be slaughtered. There was no cover on the cliff face, no way to retreat quickly. Just 700 men climbing single-file up routes that could be swept by machine gun fire in seconds. Private Dan Kennelly from Company D, 85th Regiment, though he was with the 86th for this operation, later recalled the moment before they started climbing. General Hayes had done something unprecedented a few days earlier. He'd gathered enlisted men and explained the entire tactical plan to them, something generals didn't do with privates. Hayes told them he had complete confidence in their ability, intelligence, and esprit de corps. The general knew something the Germans didn't. These weren't regular infantry being asked to do something beyond their training. These were men who'd spent years preparing for exactly this kind of mission. At 17 minutes after 1 in the morning, February 19th, the first assault teams began climbing Trail Number 1. 30 minutes later, the main columns followed, moving in single file up all 4 routes. The fog that hung over the lower elevations of the ridge helped conceal them. A biting, wet wind whipped around the climbers as they worked their way up the slick rock. Every man moved with careful deliberation. Hands found holds in the darkness, boots scraped on shale, and everyone froze, expecting machine gun fire. Nothing. The Germans were in their dugouts, staying warm, not bothering to post observers on a cliff they believed was unclimbable. Where the fixed ropes had been installed, the climbers clipped onto them with carabiners and used the rope for stability as they ascended the most vertical sections. The manila hemp was wet and cold but held firm under the weight of men and equipment. Hours passed. The columns climbed. Occasionally, loose rock would clatter down the cliff face, and everyone would stop, hearts pounding, waiting for the hail of grenades and bullets that would signal they'd been discovered. The fire never came. By 4 in the morning, February 19th, all 4 columns had reached their objectives on the summit of Riva Ridge. 700 American soldiers were now positioned on terrain the Germans had left nearly undefended because they believed it couldn't be reached from below. The Germans were about to learn that impossible is a word mountain infantry don't recognize. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At 0400 hours, as the last American soldiers pulled themselves over the lip of the cliff and onto the summit plateau, Lieutenant Colonel Hampton gave the signal. The 86th Mountain Infantry charged the German positions with rifles and grenades. The Germans of the 1044th Infantry Regiment woke to find American soldiers already on top of their supposedly impregnable ridge. The shock was complete. On most of the ridge, German resistance collapsed within minutes. Soldiers stumbled from dugouts into darkness, facing attackers they hadn't known were coming. Some surrendered immediately. Others grabbed weapons and tried to mount a defense, but the Americans had achieved total tactical surprise. Within hours, most of Riva Ridge was in American hands, but one position held out. On Pizzo di Campiano, the northernmost peak of the ridge, a German strongpoint refused to surrender. 2nd Lieutenant James Luce and his platoon from Company A found themselves cut off, surrounded, and under constant attack. The battle for Pizzo di Campiano would last through the entire day of February 19th and into the night. Luce's men were half-starved, low on ammunition, and couldn't be reinforced because German counterattacks had blocked the trails. On February 20th, as it appeared the surrounded Americans were about to be overrun, Luce made a desperate decision. He called artillery fire down on his own position. The bombardment broke up the German attack but left Luce and his men clinging to their position with German forces on 3 sides. The battle raged through another day. Finally, on February 21st, a relief column led by the battalion commander fought through and reached the summit. Luce and his tattered platoon, having held for more than 48 hours, finally came off the mountain. Remarkably, Luce had only a handful of wounded. His last words to the platoon leader who relieved him captured the situation. "They've attacked us from every direction but one, and that's the way we came up." By February 23rd, 1945, the 1st Battalion, 86th Mountain Infantry, straggled off Riva Ridge in small groups. They'd been on the mountain for 5 days in freezing conditions with minimal food, water, or sleep. Evacuation of wounded had been agonizing. 8 to 10 men were required per stretcher, along with ropes and infinite care. Some evacuations took 13 hours to move a single wounded soldier from the summit to medical aid below. The cost had been significant. 213 soldiers killed, 782 wounded, 4 taken prisoner during the battles for Riva Ridge and the subsequent assault on Mount Belvedere that the ridge's capture had enabled. But the impossible had been accomplished. A 2,000-foot vertical cliff that German commanders had dismissed as unclimbable had been scaled by 700 men in darkness, carrying full combat loads, achieving complete surprise. The tactical impact was immediate and decisive. With American forces holding Riva Ridge, the assault on Mount Belvedere proceeded on schedule. The 85th and 87th Regiments attacked from two sides on the night of February 19th. Without German artillery observers on Riva able to call fire on the attackers, Belvedere fell. Within 4 days, despite fierce German counterattacks, the breakthrough the Allies had been unable to achieve for months happened in less than a week. Highway 64 was secured. The road into the Po Valley was open. The German defensive line that had held through the winter of 1944 and 45 collapsed. Within weeks, the 10th Mountain Division would push north faster than Army logistics experts had predicted possible, driving German forces back toward the Alps and helping to end the war in Italy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The question that haunted German commanders after Riva Ridge wasn't tactical, it was conceptual. How had American forces accomplished something German doctrine said was impossible? The answer lay not in technology or firepower, but in a fundamental difference in how the two armies defined possible. German defensive doctrine in the Italian mountains was based on sound military principles: use terrain as a force multiplier, position forces on high ground where they can observe and direct fire on approaching enemies, fortify the obvious avenues of approach, leave the impossible approaches undefended because defending them wastes resources better used elsewhere. By every conventional standard, the eastern face of Riva Ridge was an impossible approach: 80-degree slopes, loose shale, 2,000 feet of vertical climbing required before reaching the summit. Any force attempting that climb would be exhausted, disorganized, and vulnerable to even minimal defensive fire. It was the kind of obstacle that military academies used as an example of terrain that channeled attacking forces into predictable kill zones. The German assessment was entirely reasonable. Regular infantry couldn't make that climb. Mechanized forces certainly couldn't. Even elite troops would struggle to reach the summit with enough combat effectiveness remaining to fight. So the Germans focused their defenses where they expected attacks to come: the more gradual western and southern approaches, where conventional military movement was possible. They were preparing for the army they expected. But the 10th Mountain Division wasn't the army anyone expected. These weren't soldiers who'd been taught that certain terrain was impassable and had accepted that teaching as gospel. These were men who'd spent years learning that mountains only stop people who don't know how to climb them. The difference wasn't physical capability, though the training at Camp Hale had certainly created exceptional fitness. The difference was conceptual. To a regular infantry commander looking at Riva Ridge, the question was, is this cliff passable? The answer, based on conventional military movement, was no. To General Hayes and the men of the 10th Mountain Division, the question was different. What do we need to do to make this cliff passable? And once the question was framed that way, the answer became technical rather than philosophical. Scout the routes, install fixed ropes at the steepest sections, train the men to climb in darkness, move at night when German observation is weakest, use fog and weather for concealment, climb in single file to minimize noise. The techniques weren't revolutionary. Rock climbers had been using these methods for decades. What was revolutionary was applying civilian climbing techniques to military assault operations on a scale never attempted before. 700 men, full combat equipment, 4 separate routes, all in darkness against an enemy position. The execution required 3 elements that rarely aligned in military operations: specialized training, appropriate equipment, and commanders willing to attempt something outside established doctrine. The training had happened at Camp Hale. The equipment, rope, pitons, carabiners, was simple and available. The Commander Major General Hayes was confident enough in his soldiers' abilities to authorize an operation that looked insane on paper. Intelligence reports captured after the battle revealed German confidence had been their vulnerability. German officers had written assessments stating that the eastern face of Riva Ridge provided complete security due to terrain. Those assessments were filed and accepted as fact. No one questioned them because they seemed obviously true. This was the same intellectual trap that had caught military thinkers throughout history. Fortress walls are impregnable until someone invents siege artillery. Cavalry charges are devastating until someone invents the machine gun. Mountain ridges are unassailable until someone builds a division that specializes in climbing mountains. The Germans defending Riva Ridge weren't incompetent. They were conventional. They'd looked at the terrain through the lens of traditional military doctrine and made reasonable conclusions. What they couldn't conceive was an American division that would throw out traditional military doctrine and replace it with rope, pitons, and 3 years of training in the Rocky Mountains. The tactical success at Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere opened the floodgates for Allied advance in northern Italy. Within days of securing the ridgeline, the 10th Mountain Division was pushing north through terrain that German commanders had expected would take weeks to penetrate. In early March, the division fought its way north of Canole and moved to within 15 miles of Bologna. On March 5th, while Brazilian units captured Castelnuovo, the 85th and 87th Infantry Regiments took Mount della Spey and Castel Diano respectively, cutting Axis routes of resupply and communication into the Po Valley. The German defensive line that had held Allied forces at bay through the brutal winter of 1944 and 45 was collapsing faster than Wehrmacht. Commanders could reposition reserves. The speed of advance shocked even Allied headquarters. Army logistics experts had calculated movement rates based on conventional infantry operations in mountainous terrain. The 10th Mountain Division was exceeding those projections by substantial margins. Part of this came from fitness men who'd trained at 14,000 feet in Colorado, found the lower Italian mountains almost comfortable by comparison. Part came from tactical skill soldiers who understood mountain warfare could identify routes and approaches that regular infantry wouldn't attempt. But the largest advantage was psychological. The division had proven at Riva Ridge that terrain didn't define limits. That confidence translated into aggressive movement through supposedly difficult ground that slowed other units. The division maintained defensive positions for 3 weeks in mid-March, anticipating German counteroffensives that never materialized with sufficient force. By April, as German defenses across northern Italy began their final collapse, the 10th Mountain Division was driving toward Lake Garda and the Austrian border. The final days of the Italian campaign brought both triumph and tragedy. On April 14, 1945, the division resumed offensive operations, pressing forward on multiple axes toward the Po Valley. The advance was relentless. German units that had fought stubbornly for months were now in full retreat, trying desperately to escape north before Allied forces could cut them off completely. By late April, elements of the division reached Lake Garda. The terrain was still challenging, steep slopes dropping into deep water, limited roads, German defenders fighting delaying actions at every choke point. On April 30th, as the division was conducting amphibious operations across the lake, tragedy struck twice within hours. 25 soldiers from the division were crossing Lake Garda in an amphibious vehicle when it sank. It was one of the last and most tragic losses of the Italian campaign men who'd survived months of mountain warfare, drowning in sight of victory. That same day, Colonel William Orlando Darby, founder of the United States Army Rangers and recently appointed assistant division commander, was killed by German artillery fire in Torbole. He'd been with the division for only days, directing the final movements of the advance, when shrapnel cut him down along with his sergeant major, John Evans. Darby's death came just hours before the announcement of German surrender in Italy. On May 2, 1945, German forces in Italy capitulated. The war in Europe would continue for 6 more days, until Victory in Europe Day on May 8. But for the 10th Mountain Division, combat operations were finished. The cost had been staggering for a unit that fought for only 114 days. Of nearly 20,000 soldiers who served with the division in Italy, 975 were killed, 3,871 were wounded, 20 were taken as prisoners of war. The casualty rate was among the highest of any American division in the theater, reflecting the brutal nature of mountain warfare and the aggressive tactics the division employed. Private First Class John Magrath was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during the mountain fighting. The citation detailed how Magrath had single-handedly attacked German positions, providing covering fire that allowed his unit to advance before being killed by enemy fire. His was the only Medal of Honor awarded to the division during the war, though numerous other soldiers received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Distinguished Service Crosses for actions in the mountains. The 10th Mountain Division returned to the United States in July 1945, with orders to begin preparing for the invasion of Japan, scheduled for November 2nd. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August ended the war before that invasion became necessary. The division was deactivated in November 1945. But the story of what those soldiers accomplished didn't end with deactivation. It transformed American culture in ways that had nothing to do with military operations. Approximately 260 veterans of the 10th Mountain Division, many of them European refugees who'd fled Nazi persecution, went on to revolutionize the American ski industry. They founded ski resorts across the country. They established ski patrol systems. They opened ski schools. They brought European skiing technique and culture to mountains across the American West. Vail, Colorado, one of America's most famous ski resorts, was founded by Pete Seibert, a 10th Mountain Division veteran who'd been wounded at Riva Ridge. The longest ski run at Vail is named Riva Ridge in honor of the battle. Aspen, Sugarbush, Whiteface Mountain, and dozens of other resorts were founded or developed by 10th Mountain veterans who took their mountain expertise and applied it to building an industry that barely existed before the war. The National Ski Patrol, which had recruited soldiers for the division, grew from a small organization into a national institution with approximately 30,000 members. The connection between the patrol and the division remained strong for decades. Every February 18th, ski patrols across America commemorate the assault on Riva Ridge, recognizing that the civilian organization's decision to help build a military mountain unit had created something that outlasted the war. Hugh Evans, a 10th Mountain veteran, explained it to reporters years later. After the war ended, there were about 260 soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division who started the ski resorts you see now, all across the country. They started ski patrols, ski schools. They were instrumental in building the industry as we know it today. These weren't men looking to capitalize on military glory. They were simply doing what they'd always done, going to mountains and figuring out how to make them accessible. The military impact of Riva Ridge extended far beyond the immediate tactical success in Italy. The operation became a case study in specialized warfare and the value of tailored training for specific operational environments. For decades after World War II, military planners studying mountain warfare operations returned to Riva Ridge as the defining example of how specialized units could accomplish missions that conventional forces couldn't attempt. The 10th Mountain Division was reactivated in 1985 and based at Fort Drum, New York. The modern division maintains mountain warfare training as part of its identity, though its primary mission is light infantry operations across all terrain types. Soldiers assigned to the modern 10th Mountain Division walk streets named Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere, constant reminders of the legacy they're expected to uphold. In February 2025, exactly 80 years after the original assault, soldiers from the modern 10th Mountain Division returned to Italy and climbed Riva Ridge following the same routes their predecessors had used in 1945. The climb took hours. The terrain was still brutal: snow, ice, mud, steep slopes that required careful navigation even in daylight without combat loads. At the summit, standing where 700 men had achieved complete surprise against German defenders 8 decades earlier, the modern soldiers felt the weight of heritage and legacy. One officer remarked, "Walking in their footsteps, you appreciate how much they struggled and what they had to overcome. The easy was difficult, and the difficult was impossible." Descendants of original 10th Mountain Division soldiers have made pilgrimages to Riva Ridge in increasing numbers. Children and grandchildren of men who climbed that cliff in darkness now hike the same trails, trying to understand what their fathers and grandfathers accomplished. Peggy Hall, daughter of William Parker, who was only 18 when he climbed Riva Ridge, made the trip twice. Her father never really talked about his emotions, she said, just the camaraderie that the men had. That camaraderie was passed down through generations. Approximately 100 descendants attended a commemorative trip in September 2025, visiting the small towns and battlefields where their family members had fought. About 24 attempted the actual climb. All of them made it to the summit, just as their ancestors had 80 years before. The Florence American Cemetery contains 4,392 headstones of American military service members killed in the Italian campaign. 356 belong to 10th Mountain Division soldiers. The tablets of the missing list an additional 1,409 names of those whose bodies were never recovered. Modern 10th Mountain Division commanders bring their staffs to the cemetery regularly, ensuring that new generations of soldiers understand the cost of the legacy they carry. Major General Gregory Anderson, commanding the division in 2023, addressed his officers among the white headstones. Many of you have served in combat and have lost people you know. It is always tough to come back to the cemeteries and reflect on the cost of what our business is ultimately about. It's the risk of being in this profession. The strategic calculations of Riva Ridge's impact have been debated by military historians for decades. Some argue that the breakthrough in northern Italy shortened the war by as much as 2 weeks, though measuring such counterfactuals is inherently imprecise. What's indisputable is that the German defensive line in the northern Apennines, which had held Allied forces for months at tremendous cost in casualties and time, collapsed within days of the 10th Mountain Division's assault on Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere. German commanders had built their defensive strategy on the assumption that certain terrain provided security without requiring extensive fortification. Riva Ridge was supposed to be impassable, so resources were concentrated elsewhere. When that supposedly impassable ridge fell to American forces in a single night, the entire German defensive concept unraveled. Positions that had been mutually supporting were suddenly isolated. Artillery observers who directed fire on Allied approaches were dead or captured. Supply routes that had been secure were now exposed to American artillery. The psychological impact on German defenders may have been as significant as the tactical consequences. For months, German soldiers in Italy had been told they were holding impregnable positions in defensible terrain. The swift collapse of Riva Ridge shattered that confidence. If elite American mountain troops could climb a 2,000-foot cliff in darkness and overrun positions that were supposed to be secure, what other supposedly impossible operations might they attempt? German commanders began second-guessing their defensive assessments, reinforcing positions that might have been left lightly defended, spreading their forces thinner, trying to guard against unconventional approaches. The broader lesson of Riva Ridge wasn't technical, it was conceptual. Military doctrine exists for good reasons. It captures centuries of experience, codifies proven tactics, and provides frameworks that allow massive organizations to coordinate complex operations. But doctrine can also become intellectual prison, when commanders forget that it represents accumulated wisdom rather than immutable law. The German defenders of Riva Ridge weren't stupid or incompetent. They were following reasonable military logic based on conventional assessment of terrain. Their failure was in assuming that conventional assessment was the only assessment. They prepared for the army they expected, not the army that arrived. General George Hayes understood something that his German counterparts missed. Doctrine defines what's normal, but warfare rewards those who can identify when abnormal approaches create advantages. The 10th Mountain Division's entire existence was an abnormal approach, building a division around specialized mountain warfare skills that conventional military wisdom said weren't necessary. Hayes looked at Riva Ridge through the lens of his soldiers' capabilities rather than conventional military doctrine. Instead of asking whether the cliff was passable by standard infantry movement, he asked whether his mountain-trained troops could climb it. The answer was yes, which made the operation possible. The execution still required exceptional skill, courage, and luck. But the conceptual leap, recognizing that his soldiers could accomplish something, doctrine said, was impossible, was what turned Riva Ridge from an insurmountable obstacle into an opportunity. This pattern has repeated throughout military history. Specialized training and equipment allow forces to operate in environments or ways that conventional forces can't match. British commandos using toggle ropes to scale cliffs in Norway, American Rangers climbing Pointe du Hoc on D-Day using rocket-propelled grappling hooks, Special operations forces conducting missions in terrain that conventional units avoid. The principle remains constant. Specialized capabilities expand the range of possible operations, and expanded possibilities create opportunities for surprise. But there's a counterpoint that military organizations struggle with constantly. Specialized units are expensive. Training takes years. Equipment is custom. Personnel are difficult to replace. And most operational environments don't require specialized capabilities. The vast majority of World War II combat involved conventional infantry, armor, and artillery operating in terrain that didn't require mountain warfare skills. The 10th Mountain Division fought for 114 days in Italy. For most of the war, those highly trained mountain soldiers were waiting for missions that required their specific expertise. Was that inefficient? Possibly. But the question is whether the missions they accomplished when their expertise was needed, particularly Riva Ridge, justified the investment in specialized training. The answer depends on how you measure value. In lives saved by breaking the German defensive line quickly? In time gained by accelerating the Allied advance? In tactical options created by having forces that could operate where conventional forces couldn't? By any of those measures, the 10th Mountain Division's specialization paid dividends that far exceeded its costs. The soldiers who climbed Riva Ridge in the darkness of February 18, 1945, weren't thinking about doctrine or military theory. They were focused on immediate physical challenges, finding handholds on wet rock, clipping onto fixed ropes, moving quietly while carrying 55 pounds of equipment, trusting that the men ahead had secured the route. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.